Now, you know what we usually have in our head is that tape of judgment. We just make judgment calls about people all the time. Just walking through the grocery store and it's, when will that woman get that child to settle down? Boy, you stand to lose a few pounds too. What's she buying Doritos for? And then, oh, look at that guy. Who does he think he is? And he's butting into, excuse me. And then we're finally driving away. And it's, hey, don't cut me. Where'd you learn to drive? Hey, old lady, get out of the way, Just every judgment. Our thoughts about everyone all the time. When you meet someone and say, hey, nice to meet you. In the back of our mind, I wouldn't be caught dead dressed like her. My goodness. Oh, it's good to meet you. Oh, that's quite a grip. Well, he really thinks he's macho. Well, obviously, he's probably a little insecure. And we just got this tape running all the time where we put people in categories. We slot and we judge, and it's normal. It's the normal headspace we live in. What would it be like as you're walking through the park and you hear that dog yapping? And you think, oh man, it's a yappy dog. Why can't that person begin to teach that? We just stop and say, actually, you know what? What matters right now is not the dog. It's not the yelling of the kid. It's not who got in front of me in traffic. It's that each one of these cars is filled with a person Christ died for. That person I just want to curse inside is actually a person who is infinitely valuable and precious to God. This person I'm talking to right now as I talk to them, is someone that God's heart is broken for. And he's turning everything upside down to try and find. And yet he's not going to force it. What would it be like if the first and dominant thought you held in your head was the kind of thought that Jesus would have for them when he was talking to them? Because that's a step of you becoming a disciple, of you being apprenticed by Jesus, of you becoming Christ-like, saying, I want to be more like my master. I want to have the mind of Christ. Let this mind be in you, which was also in Christ Jesus, says Apostle Paul in Philippians 2, right? And then what does he say? He didn't hold on to his power. He came down, laid it all down so that he might die on the cross and save people. That's the mind of Christ.
Welcome to episode 8 of the Beneath the Surface podcast. I am joined by a very interesting man by the name of Bruxy Cavey. Did I pronounce that right?
You did. Well done.
Oh, great. Okay. So he is the creator of the Meeting House, which is a church for people that aren't in the church. And he is the author of the book Reunion, which is your newest book. And you had a previous book entitled The End of Religion, right? Is that correct?
That's right. That's it.
Great. Okay. So I guess let's start with the idea of the Meeting House, a church for people that aren't in the church. Why is that needed? Is it why is church such a bad thing? Why are people flocking to this idea of a church for people that aren't in the church? Why would someone not be into church?
Okay, sure. Thanks. First of all, thanks, Hayden, for just having me on this podcast. And I'm happy to talk about that. So there seems to be a large and growing demographic of people within our culture who would fall in the category of saying, I'm spiritual, but not religious. I'm open to the idea of God. Maybe I'm fairly friendly to the idea of Jesus and his teaching. I might have some Christian background. I'm not even sure where I stand spiritually, but I'd like some kind of root system in my life. I'd like to get together with other people and at least feel that there's a safe place for me to ask questions about spiritual faith. That demographic is large and growing. So we really wanted to create a church specifically for them, for those kinds of folks, to say we can create a home for you, a safe place for spiritual seekers to come and ask questions.
So is it fair to say that maybe people feel that churches aren't those places or are no longer those places? Like, I guess what I'm wondering is why do people distrust a church, or what is it that you're providing that a church doesn't? If this growing demographic of spiritual but not religious, I mean, what exactly does that mean, or what are people seeing in churches that makes them uneasy about identifying as religious, at least in your opinion?
Yeah. Yeah, no, good question. I mean, first of all, it's probably worth identifying there are a lot of people who still thrive very much within a traditional church context and find that it really meets their spiritual needs. But having said that, I think different people have different stories, as you might expect. The road to whether it's atheism or theism or any particular religious or non-religious worldview has often many different unique variations to it. But in this case, a theme that I often hear is either some people, it is a more intellectual road that they have just asked so many questions that it eventually, that they couldn't find answers to, or no one would address their questions. So they eventually got to the point of giving up on the whole enterprise. And then having done that and lived on the other side of the track, so to speak, for a period of time, they begin to sense that this extreme is not for them either. They're not getting answers to their questions, perhaps on the more atheist or agnostic side. And so they begin to reapproach just the concept of God or Jesus or faith or spirituality. But now they're doing so cautiously, and they don't want to just throw themselves into a church where they're not going to be willing to or able to ask questions and challenge things. And so there's a lot of people who've gone back and forth. They've lived on both sides of the fence of belief and non-belief, and they've been dissatisfied on both sides. And so now they're trying to figure out where they stand. And so that's often the case. In some cases, it's just a matter of personal hurt. They've had a real negative experience with a religious background. Sometimes it's a Christian religious background or a different religious background. And so they aren't willing to jettison the idea of God yet, but they also are very cautious because they have been burned in the past. So sometimes it's a very personal story. Sometimes it's more of an intellectual route.
So maybe like I think what you're implying is that the ability to question things isn't so welcome in a lot of kind of traditional church settings, or the what you're kind of told what religion is supposed to be, and there's not enough wiggle room for personal interpretation or that sort of thing in a traditional church setting. Is that fair to say, do you think, or is that kind of what you're getting at?
Yeah, that can be the case. Yeah, it can be the case with many religious traditions, including a variety of Christian traditions, that we grow up, we have a question, we ask our parents. You go to school, you have a question, you raise your hand, you ask the teacher. You go to university, you ask the professor. And then they come to church or mosque or synagogue or some religious institution, and they're told to be quiet, pay attention, and do not question what the leader says. And that approach to learning and just being in community does not feel healthy. And I get that. So one of the things we try to do is just make space for questions, for doubt, for disagreement, and to say that all of these things don't have to be a threat to spiritual enterprise. They can actually enhance someone's faith, enhance someone's spirituality by making it more robust and three-dimensional, having these kinds of questioning conversations.
So is there a risk, perhaps the risk of sounding a bit naive, but is there a risk of maybe throwing the baby out with the bathwater to some extent? I mean, I've always kind of been of the belief that some people are perhaps more maybe qualified is the word, but maybe have a deeper understanding of biblical text or any sort of spiritual text, and I've always kind of felt, well, maybe they should be held up as leaders of religious communities, and if you take away the authority of religious leaders and kind of put it in the hands of the people, so to speak, do you risk damaging some religious teaching that could go on because you're creating kind of a marketplace for ideas? So if one person doesn't like one church, they can just kind of go to this other one that suits them more, even if it may not even be the best for them spiritually. They just think it is because they happen to agree with it. I mean, is that something that...
Yeah. I think you're raising good issues. You're going to make a good pastor one day. I think so. This is very key, and it helps to know that it's not an either or, but it is a both and. In other words, authoritarian leadership that cannot be questioned. That is not the answer. But then neither is the answer of saying, all right, we will have no leadership. And it doesn't matter if you spent your life studying the ancient texts, your voice doesn't count any more than someone who's just stumbled in for the first time and gets to say whatever they want. And we'll listen to all voices equally. That's not going to help move the ball forward. Like any learning enterprise, there are some who have studied more than others, and we should respect that and want to learn from them. But I think we don't have to be at either pole or either extreme, that we can say we honor leadership. We hope that someone in leadership has done their homework and has more to teach us. At the same time, you can honor leadership without having it being unquestionable, without it being unapproachable, and having to pretend that whatever comes from that leader has to always be perfect and untouchable. I think just like university professors, we learn from them. We don't do the lecture. We don't all take turns in class giving the lecture. The professor does. At the same time, we have an opportunity to push back, disagree, ask questions, and that's actually part of how we learn from that professor. So I think that we can have a both-and approach in the church.
Right. That's a good example for sure. The university professor kind of standing in front of the class, but certainly isn't infallible in terms of what they're saying. How do you approach that? I mean, obviously you have taken on a leadership position in your own life. I mean, how do you handle people that maybe question your interpretation of things? I mean, do you kind of hash it out in private? Is that something you do in publicly? I mean, how do you handle that type of internal? I wouldn't say conflict, but sometimes it might be conflict. I mean, do you have any strategies for that sort of thing, or leadership strategies on how to effectively lead when people are questioning your authority even?
Yes, that's a great question. I think that a good rule of thumb is to follow or to respond to someone in kind, that is through whatever medium they're already using. So if someone is asking publicly with a public post, then I will probably respond publicly and engage them in a way that they've already said they're comfortable with. And if someone wants to talk privately, then talk privately. Certainly, I think when you can mix mediums. For instance, if someone challenges you publicly, I first of all would love to invite them. Let's get together for a drink and a chat one-on-one, and push it from a public discourse to something that's more intimate and private and relational. We'll probably understand each other better, because sometimes when you're caught in public discourse, there's a lot of ego at play. People are afraid of being embarrassed or shamed publicly, and so we'll get our backups and be more defensive, which is not really good for learning. And if I sense that's the case, I'll often just invite someone, let's get together personally and chat over a drink. One thing I think would not be acceptable is if someone wanted to talk privately or personally, and we pushed in the other direction and said, no, I want to make this public, and I'm going to try and out you or something like this. So try to respond to people in a way that leaves their dignity and honor intact, and that's maybe sometimes a little bit different case by case.
Right. So I mean, obviously you've kind of started this meeting house thing, kind of using a Christian framework anyway, or at least a Jesus framework. But I do see that you've done some lectures on Jesus and the Buddha, and you seem to also at least think that the spiritual thing is a very private kind of personal journey, even if you do have kind of a community that you're rooted in. Why Jesus over other religious leaders? I mean, are there, what do you see in that type of framework, the Jesus framework or the Christian framework, maybe that you don't see in other religious movements, or maybe you do, and maybe it's just your life circumstance that drove you to or that drove your interest in Jesus and not another religious leader? I mean, what is it about Jesus that you find appealing when pursuing this type of meeting house idea?
Yeah. Good. Why Jesus? And when first of all, it's worth establishing that I think we could find truth pretty much everywhere. As a Christian, I believe, as the Bible says, that to be human is to be made in the image of God, that we are all God-like, made like God, made in his image, And that means that we have infinite worth and value, creativity, and we have lots to offer because our brains are marvelous things. And so I think that every individual, as well as every religious tradition, will probably have something, and every secular philosophy will have something of value to contribute to the conversation, our self-understanding and understanding the universe we're in. But I zero in on Jesus because the combination of the things he teaches, I can bits and pieces all over the map in all kinds of traditions, but the way Jesus kind of coalesces all of those bits and pieces into one whole in this amazing good news message, I have not found that unique recipe, so to speak, in any other religious tradition. This combination of radical forgiveness, both receiving it and not falling under a burden of personal shame, but then also turning around and offering it, both for your health and for the other person's health, is something that 2,000 years later, I think modern psychology would catch up to and say, this is radical forgiveness is so important for healing and wholeness in a world where people damage each other and we're victims and victimizers. And that's something that Jesus put front and central in his teaching from the start. That and love, enemy love, not being burdened by loving some people and hating other people and trying to steward that, but just loving generously, completely. And I think probably the thing that I find most unique about Jesus is he is the only world religious leader that I'm aware of who claimed to be shutting down his own religion. That gets my attention. That stands out as completely unique, that he is the Messiah of Judaism who says this religion has had a good run as far as the hallmarks of faith, the Torah observance and the temple sacrificial worship. And then he says, it's been good, but now we're shutting it down. There's going to be no more sacrifices. We do not have to keep the Torah. We are starting fresh. I don't know of that happening in world religious history under any other leader. So even if I didn't believe in Jesus, I would still find him the most interesting man in the world philosophically.
Well, I could certainly relate to that because as I don't know if I've mentioned this to any of my listeners at any point, but I would consider myself an atheist, but Jesus certainly is a very interesting man. And in university, I studied, I was a religious studies major and took every class I could on Jesus and the historical Jesus and how we know what we know about him. And, certainly a very interesting figure. And I can appreciate also the parables he tells and the literary value of the Bible and the stories. And so while I would say I'm an atheist, I don't really buy into kind of the militant atheism of, say, like Richard Dawkins and Sam Harris and people like that who see absolutely no value in kind of the Bible or even the literary value of the Bible. It's very strange to me that people kind of cast those stories aside and don't find Jesus interesting. That is such a foreign concept to me. So I guess you kind of outlined in your last answer, I think, kind of the thesis of your book In the End of Religion, that Jesus wasn't actually trying to establish a new religion, but was trying to bring an end to his old religion. So maybe let's just elaborate a little bit. What do we mean when we say religion? Why is it not good to be religious, say, or why do we distrust this word now, religion? It's kind of shameful to be religious these days. Your spiritual is more acceptable, but to be religious is a bit of a dirty word now. I mean, why do you think this is? Among some people, I should say.
Well, for some people, that's true. On the outside looking in, sometimes it's hard to see the good aspects of any religion because the negative aspects overshadow it. And I get that. World religions have a history, not all, but many have a history of violence, and that includes the Christian religion, which is doubly ironic because the Christian religion is founded on the guy who was known as the Prince of Peace, who taught love your neighbor and love your enemy and turn the other cheek and do good even to those who want to be spiteful and harm you. And so to build a violent religion on the teaching of that one seems like one of the greatest and most sickening ironies in world religious history. But violence is not the exclusive territory of the Christian religion. So there's examples of extreme violence in almost all religions. And I think even if there are good things in religion, when they are exceedingly violent, it's hard to slow down enough to see anything good. And why would you want to? So if I offer someone a taste of an apple from my own apple orchard and I say, these are the best apples ever, go ahead and have a bite. And they take a bite and inside they see a worm, or worse, half a worm after they've taken a bite. At that point, for me to say, oh, well, it's only half a worm, or it's only a worm, but the rest of the apple tastes great, don't you think? And to keep talking about the value of the apple is probably misdirected and doesn't appreciate the fact that, frankly, a worm spoils your experience of an apple. And violence and horrific judgment and torture and some of these things, they spoil our appreciation of what any religion has to say. And so I think that when we look at just the history of religion, for many people, the word religion itself has taken on a negative connotation, which I fully understand. I think the violence is there because we're human beings, and unfortunately, whether it's political systems, whether it's theistic or atheistic philosophies, we can find examples of extreme violence. What I would want to call people to, at least those people who say they like Jesus, is to follow the way of Jesus. Don't just use his name and slap it as a label onto your violent religion, but people who at least say, I like Jesus, I appreciate his teachings, then to actually follow them. And he taught a way of radical, nonviolent enemy love and peace. And so I'm hoping for a new generation of Jesus followers who will really live out his teachings.
So what do you make of the stories in the Bible where Jesus is sort of I wouldn't say violent, but at least, and perhaps rightly so, or appropriately outraged? Like, I'm thinking of the money changers scene in particular. I mean, is there a place for appropriate moral outrage in someone that follows Jesus at the evil in the world, or things like that? Like, often people that maybe aren't familiar with the Bible and the stories in it are often very surprised that Jesus, that scene even exists, where he's, there's a few great dramatic reenactments in some documentaries, and I always love showing them because they're always like so flabbergasted that here's this guy who's the Prince of Peace, and he's like completely flipping everything over. I mean, I guess, is there a place for that in Jesus if you're following Jesus and appreciate his philosophy and his moral attitudes? Is there a place for appropriate moral outrage, or how do you make sense of those types of scenes?
Right. Yeah, sure. You point to something that's really central to understanding Jesus well, is both his acceptance of the outsider, the sinner, the partier, and the person who just felt shamed because they weren't living a moral life, or felt like they were on the outside of the religious circles and were not accepted by the insiders of religion. He always made space for those people. They were his followers. They were his friends. But the religious elite who were doing the oppressing and the judging and who were hypocritical in the process, he didn't have kind things to say to them. He challenged their hypocrisy. Hypocrisy was his number one bugaboo. You hypocrites, he would say. And then he not only challenged the hypocritical religious elite, he challenged the whole religious system. And that's where his temple tantrum, for lack of a better word, is at the center of him. He walks into the Jewish temple after this parade where he rides into Jerusalem on a donkey and they all shout, Hosanna, Hosanna. And they would expect the first thing that he would do, if he's the Jewish Messiah, would be to go to the temple and offer a sacrifice and bless the temple. And instead, he goes to the temple and he turns over the tables where they were exchanging money to buy sacrifices, so the people can't buy sacrifices. Then he opens up all the cages where they're keeping, whether it's the rams or the doves, and he lets all the birds and the animals fly away, and he drives them out with a whip. And he effectively shuts down the temple sacrificial system. I don't know for how long. How long would it have taken to gather up all the animals again and return order? Did it take a day? I don't know. But it's like his actions were a symbolic condemnation on the religious system. I'm going to to shut this down and then pronounce not a blessing over this, but condemnation. You no longer have to kill an animal to get God's forgiveness. You no longer have to go through a system of priests in order to hear from God. He says this should be a house of prayer, where each person then in a house of prayer gets to just talk to God directly, and the sacrifices aren't important anymore. And that kind of shutting down of the system is something he not only taught with his words, but then he symbolically performed it with his actions. And in the end, that kind of stand against the religious system is what got him killed.
Is it just a matter of who it's directed against then, or is that an encouragement to kind of buck the system to a certain extent and be more privately oriented towards God? I mean, like, to me, I suppose one of the things I'm wondering is, to me, there is value in certain hierarchies or in certain social systems that, I guess you just don't want to be going around destroying things that you don't know what the consequences will be. And maybe Jesus had a good sense of what he was doing at the time. Assuming that story happened in that way. I mean, do you see any message in that story telling you, when that's appropriate or when it's not appropriate? Like, is there a message in that can kind of guide you to figure out, when should you, throw a temple tantrum, which I love that. I've never heard that before, but that's great.
Yeah.
And when you should kind of be loving, peaceful, and turn the other cheek, sort of thing. Do you see a message in that story to anyone?
No, great question. So I see a guideline here, and it's good that we look for one, like you're saying. A couple of things. First of all, Jesus never aggressed against people. So one of the things that's conspicuously absent from this story, and the same story gets told 4 times in the New Testament in every one of the Gospels, the Greco-Roman biographies we have of the life of Jesus, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, each one tells this story from a slightly different angle. And what is conspicuously absent is any aggression towards individuals. In fact, John is the one who records that he even fashioned a whip to drive out the animals, but he never uses it on people. He doesn't turn over the tables and then punch the money changers in the face. And there's no, people are honored, but the system itself is rebuked. So that's one guideline for us. You call a spade, and you stand up against whether it's religious hypocrisy, etc. We never aggress against people themselves. Then secondly, there are things that Jesus does that assert his authority over the religious system that we can appreciate and learn from, but we don't have to mimic. For instance, in all of the tellings of this same story, Jesus never at some point says, "Come on, disciples, join me. Let's start turning over tables." Instead, they stand back and they watch Jesus take authority of the whole system, because when you put it in the context of his larger message, he was saying, I am now going to fulfill the religious system. I will be the last sacrifice. That makes his crucifixion not just an unfortunate capital punishment, but that has symbolic value. The crucifixion becomes the end of the sacrificial system because Jesus offers his own life as the last sacrifice. So he becomes the end of the sacrificial system. He becomes symbolically the priest who offers the sacrifice. And he said, my body is now the temple where you meet with God. So all of that becomes redundant. It gets rebuked, and Jesus replaces that religious system with himself. Then I don't have to personally say, okay, now I have to do that, and I have to turn over the tables, and then I have to get crucified, because part of the message there is that Jesus has done that on our behalf. So it's all done. So now I just get to appreciate that, and then also not to try and fall into the same traps of hypocrisy that he was rebuking in the first century.
Yeah, those are fairly reasonable guidelines, I would say. There is a big difference between kind of rebelling against the system and throwing obstacles in its place and dismantling it, and then doing harm to the people that perpetuate this system or something like that. I mean, it kind of reminds me a little bit of maybe like purging, right? Like there's a difference between dismantling a corrupt system and then purging people out of that system, right? I mean, we kind of know how that goes. It's not a fun path to go down. So yeah, I mean, that's very, very perceptive, I would say. So I've already mentioned kind of my atheistic viewpoint to a certain extent. And the reason I would say that, it may seem weird because I kind of am agreeing with you about a lot of these things, that the stories have value. We can both appreciate Jesus. But the reason I kind of hold on to that atheist label is because I guess the idea of kind of a God never enters into it for me. Like, Jesus was a person. He was a very remarkable person, very moral, and the stories have literary value. But the idea of kind of God never enters into it for me. Where does that come into play for you and for the Meeting House? I mean, where does your relationship with Jesus bring you? Obviously, you think he was more than just kind of a person. He was more than that. And I would say that's kind of where we would probably differentiate or part ways in the metaphysics of it all, not so much in the history and the stories and the historical accuracy of it all. It's more in the metaphysics. So where does that enter into play for you?
Oh, yeah, great. Thanks for asking. It seems as though many theists start with God and then figure out what version of God they believe in. So they'll look at different logical arguments or logic from reason or history or fine-tuning of the universe or different arguments for the existence of God. And once they've concluded there must be a God, you've solved maybe one issue, but what God is that, and what religion does that God subscribe to? And eventually they may arrive at Jesus or some other version of religion as the most correct view of God. I actually start at it from a completely different point of view. I start with Jesus. I fall in love with his teachings. I think what he offers this world is unprecedented and it's unparalleled. No one before him and no one since him has offered him this unique way of love as the overarching guiding ethic. Our Muslim friends have Sharia law, but Jesus offers Sharia love, which is, Sharia is an Arabic word meaning the way, and Jesus just says it's not about the law, not even the law of Moses, which was only temporary, and he actually sets himself up against the law of Moses on occasion and says, no, I want to just teach you how to let love be your guiding ethic. I just haven't seen that anywhere. So I fall in love with Jesus and his teachings. I think I could learn, my life could be richer as I orient myself around Jesus. And then I realized at some point, wait a second, I'm trusting Jesus on all these different issues to guide me. And, what does he have to say about God? Well, Jesus believed there was a God. He was drunk on God and thought God could be our great helper in all things. And I think, well, why do I trust Jesus on all these other points and don't ride the Jesus train all the way to the end? And so I actually end up believing in God because I trust Jesus. It's not the other way around. And I just think, well, if Jesus says there's a God, he's right about everything. I can't test whether there's a God or not, but I can at least test the best that Bruxy Cavey can test anything, whether or not the other teachings of Jesus make sense in this world. And when I see his ethical teachings and his teachings about religion and how it works out in this world, I think, yeah, okay, his teachings have merit. And then I trust him on the whole God issue.
Okay, so it's sort of like a loyalty thing almost, or a trust issue. So he says that at least he had a connection with God, an intimate one, and so through him you are, for lack of a better word, forced along the same belief path as he was. Is that? Yeah. Did I get that?
For lack of a better word, I think there are better words.
Okay.
If Jesus, if he, it is loyalty, but it's not blind faith loyalty. It's an evidential loyalty. Sometimes within scientific circles or within reasonable debate circles, they'll talk about following the evidence wherever it leads. Let's follow the evidence wherever it leads. And so we can't prove atheism is true beyond a shadow of a doubt. We can't prove theism is true beyond a shadow of a doubt. But for me, as I follow the evidence wherever it leads, and Jesus shows me repeated evidence that he has an insight into the human condition, into the nature of world religion, into the needs of our society in a way that I can't find anywhere else. Then I follow that testable evidence into the realm of the untestable, and I say, all right, the evidence is stacked up here that Jesus has an insight I should listen to. Therefore, I listen to him when he says there is a God. So I can't prove it, but I do think it is in the end a leap of faith. Both atheism and theism, I think, is a leap of faith. But in this case, I believe I have run the ramp of reason in order to take the leap of faith.
Fair enough. It kind of reminds me, I read a really good book. I don't know if you've ever read it. It's called A Rumor of Angels by a guy named Peter Berger. And it kind of follows, I think, this same idea. It's not angels exist. It's a rumor of them. You know, it's like there seems to be some sort of hint or a pointing in that direction that's not provable or testable. But just ideas that seem to point that maybe there's something more there. So he had a few of them. One was my favorite one was humor, that laughter exists and that there's something something to be said for that.
Interesting.
And then the other one is the fact that there are certain things that we can't help but admit are evil, right? So I think he kind of pointed to the Holocaust and said, well, it's hard to explain away something like the Holocaust without some sort of metaphysical idea of evil. And if there's a metaphysical evil, then there must be some sort of absolute good as well. So that was another thing. It's like, it's not provable in a scientific sense, but it just seems to kind of point in that direction. Like there's something more here than the material. It's a suspicion or an intuition. Is that similar? Maybe to what you're saying?
It's true. Something can be logical. Yeah, right. Sorry. Something can be logical without being provable. We may not have absolute ironclad evidence, but if we follow a trail of logic, it can at least point us in a certain trajectory. Scott Derrickson is a director, a movie director, Hollywood director who takes the same approach, and he's directed movies like The Exorcism of Emily Rose and Deliverance from Evil. And he comes from a Christian worldview, believes in God, but also he did Doctor Strange, and so he's done some fairly great movies. But in his more sinister movies about demonic possession and exorcism, I heard him interviewed, and he said, I would love people to believe in God, but they're more likely to see a movie about the reality of the devil than the reality of God. And so I want to help at least raise the question, is it possible that there is genuine personal spiritual evil in this universe? And if people wrestle with that question, then they're going to have to also wrestle with the question of perhaps there is real personal spiritual good in this universe, and that's what we call God. And I think both are true. And you also raised the kind of the moral issue of, how do we wrestle with things like the Holocaust, and how do we even call the Holocaust pure evil without some moral framework that is larger than ourselves and even larger than the society within which we find ourselves? Because ethics have to be something more than just an agreed upon societal standard, because something inside us intuitively says that there can be an entire society agreeing on something, and that something can still be wrong. An entire society can believe in, we might say, from Western standards, female genital mutilation, or there might be an abusive practice of children in a society, and the entire tribe or society or culture can say this is a fine thing. But we can say, no, ethics are more than just agreed upon societal norms. There's something inside me that says this is absolutely wrong. I think that's also one of the pointers that allows us to say, the Holocaust just was wrong. Whether Germans in general would support it, German society may not have known the extent of it, but even if they did, that doesn't make it right just because an entire society calls it right. And one society can judge another society. So what is the overarching arbiter of those moral disagreements, and what gives us the right to call something wrong? I think that's another pointer, at least for me, for them being some higher good than just human good.
Let's bring it back to maybe something lighter. Where does the because we've talked a little bit about kind of private spiritual pursuit, I suppose, right? There's more Canadians now that are saying it's a growing category of spiritual, not religious. At the same time, among those people, it seems to be that they still want some connection to some community of some kind, and that's where something like the meeting house comes in. Why do you think this is? I mean, why can't people just let go of the community thing and have spiritual pursuit be explicitly private and exclusively private? What is driving people back into a community setting?
Yeah, great question. I think there's both a psychological answer and a spiritual answer. Psychologically speaking, we're social creatures and we experience life in community. And when we experience a bad thing, we want support. And when we experience a good thing, we want company. I mean, if you are hiking, you might enjoy the privacy and being alone. But then if you see, say, a wild animal, a deer comes very close and stares at you, and you're all by yourself, one of the first things you might think of is, oh, I wish so-and-so were here with me to see this. They're never going to believe it. That our peak experiences are something, when they're both positive or negative, that even while we're enjoying alone time, we will hunger to want to share that with someone else. We're wired for relationship. And spiritually, the partnered answer with that is, yes, we're wired for relationship because we're made in the image of God, and God is ultimately love, which is a relational concept. And so we're made in the image of love. We're made by relationship for relationship. So according to Jesus anyway, a spirituality, while we personally have to choose to opt in or opt out, and faith is a very personal choice. It may be personal, but it should never be merely private. It's something that we will want to express and will benefit by expressing it in community.
Can this be achieved in other places? I mean, clearly your meeting house idea is very popular. So it clearly addresses a need that needs to be met, or that at least people want to have met. But are there other places? Like I know for me, like I'm big into martial arts, and in my particular style, we're very close knit. We support each other. We provide all the benefits of a community, but maybe without, and we have shared values as well. Is there value to having this sense of community linked up with an explicitly spiritual pursuit over maybe a more secular view of shared values? I mean, is there something that the meeting house offers that maybe another kind of close-knit community doesn't, would you say?
Right. Yeah, I think the answer is both yes and no, in that what any community offers can be very enriching, and what you experience through the martial art community can be very meaningful, very valuable, and it can go beyond just the martial arts. Martial arts can then be the rallying point that bring you together to participate in a practice that over time you realize is actually building relationship on the side. And maybe at first we're not here as the friendship club to get close to each other. We're here to study together. But then friendship and community and a sense of brotherhood and sisterhood become the byproduct. And then someone may go through a crisis and you're there for them. You've now built a sense of closeness and mutual loyalty. I think that can be a beautiful thing. And so I wouldn't say that holds no value. I think it holds tremendous value, and many people find their social needs and their sense of purpose and belonging through those kinds of communities. I just think that for many people, finding their social connection through secular community, but then when they feel spiritually drawn, thinking, now this I will do privately and this I will do personally and keep it private, is the mistake, because you just do not experience the same degree of your own humanity when you are outside of relationship, because we're wired to relate. So to me, it would be a shame if we said, I have my, I have my karate community, I have my bowling community, and I have my painting arts class that I'm very close with. But when it comes to spiritual things, I'm a very private person, and I like to walk in the woods by myself. I like to meditate at home by myself, and say, no, that should also be a thing that brings you together closer with other people. Don't allow your spiritual life to be purely private. So there's a lot of overlap between spiritual community and other kinds of community. I agree. I just think that if you do have spiritual questions, you want to pursue spiritual things, community is going to be the best way to do it.
I can see what you're saying. And also, I think having other people around helps you think to a certain extent too, right? I mean, if you your own head could be an echo chamber, I suppose too, right? So if your spiritual questions are purely are purely private, then what you're reading reinforces what you believe, and what you believe reinforces what you're reading, and things like that. And if you never have someone else to kind of call you out on stuff or to discuss things with, you're never going to get those out of the blue ideas that come to you that change the way you think. So
it's a great point. And that's even a testament to this podcast that you're doing, and the fact that I think both for yourself and for people like myself, this is a healthy exchange to say, oh, I'm learning as I go, even in what I'm hearing you say, what I'm hearing you ask, and also as I'm then being caused to work out my own thought process. The whole experience is different than me just sitting by myself, reassuring myself that I'm right about something. That's not growth invigorating. It feels a bit stagnant and stale.
Yeah, that was certainly one of the things I was trying to accomplish with this, because I have talked to, and I wouldn't say actually that I disagree with you on much. I mean, I don't. I mean, this has been a pretty civil conversation, and really it hasn't. There's nothing said that I'd be like, oh, he's so wrong about this, or I think vice versa, the same thing with you. But one of the things I did try to do was get guests with whom I disagree with, and I have gotten a few, and you find that you actually don't disagree on much. Like a lot of the time, you find you have a lot more in common with people than you think, and the quality of some of the disagreements may be quite large, but overall, you might agree quite a bit with people. So. Thank you I'm going to take that as a compliment, because I think that was one of the things I was trying to accomplish was to kind of talk to people that aren't just that don't inhabit the same ideas that you believe. They think something different, or they think differently, and I think you kind of fit the bill for that for this one. So I appreciate that. Let's finish it off with a final. Let's finish it off with a final question, maybe. I mean, your book Reunion, and the subtitle was. Just a sec. I have the subtitle right here. Don't tell me. I have it right here. A study guide for seekers, saints, and sinners. Okay, so. Can you just tell me a bit about that book and what you were trying to accomplish, with it, what the central idea was? Just give me Cliff Notes.
Okay, yeah. And maybe I'm the pastoral version of what you're trying to accomplish with this podcast, because as the subtitle says, this is a book of studying. It studies the teachings of Jesus in a way that is user-friendly for seekers, saints, and sinners, that wants to bring together people who see themselves in different ways. Not us accusing others of being one or the other, but if someone says, I feel good about myself, I feel like I'm a saint, I love God, or someone says, I don't know what I believe, I'm seeking, or someone says, I feel cruddy about myself, I'm a sinner, it's to say, well, we don't have to put ourselves in different categories and different camps and then stay away from each other and then shoot pot shots at each other over the internet through mean Twitter memes or something. We can get together and learn together. And yes, Jesus is going to be the focus. We're all a group of people who want to learn more about Jesus, but you don't have to consider yourself a believer or a non-believer in order to engage in this conversation. So my hope is people reading the book will have a sense that regardless of where they're at spiritually, they can learn something from it, and it challenges their thinking. And then, as you mentioned, there's also a study guide to the book. So there's the book Reunion, the good news of Jesus for seekers, saints, and sinners, and then there's a study guide that goes with it, the study guide for seekers, saints, and sinners. And I think whether we use it individually or we get together with a few friends and have a book club, the experience, I'm just going through an 8-week study based on the study guide with about 60 people now in a large class setting, but then we break off into tables and discussion, and it's proving really fruitful. And people are at different places spiritually, but that's half the fun of kind of learning together as we go.
Bruxy, I've had a great time speaking with you. It was a lot of fun. I feel I learned a lot, and I think I hope other people will find value in our discussion. So just for my listeners, you can find me on Twitter and Instagram, my handle is at Ben the Surface, not Beneath the Surface, Ben the Surface, because Beneath the Surface was taken. You can follow me on Facebook. And also the podcast is available on iTunes and Android. Bruxy, where can my listeners find you?
Yeah, fantastic. On Twitter, I am Bruxy, Bruxy. That's it. On Instagram, I am Bruxy Baby. That's because my daughters chose that one for me. Let's see, Twitter and what do you call Snapchat? I think I've got them all. I don't know if I use them all, but I'm Bruxy Baby or I'm Bruxy. But a good place to start would either be at our church website, themeetinghouse.com, or at my personal blog website, which is just bruxy.com.
Great. All right. Well, again, Bruxy, thanks so much for speaking with me. I like that we were able to have a good discussion despite maybe different metaphysical starting points. And I'll definitely order your book and encourage my listeners to do the same. And so thank you again, and I'll talk to you later.
Thanks, Aiden. All the best to you and this podcast.